Here we go.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hal Shurtleff. I am the New England coordinator for the John Birch Society, and we're here at the Legislative Office Building at the New Hampshire State House in a beautiful, very cold, late January afternoon. And we're here, what we're doing here earlier today, we had members and friends distribute copies of this reprint of the New American Magazine to legislators. Levin's risky proposal, which concerns Mark Levin's call for an Article 5 convention, as well as a short little DVD on the subject done by Oklahoma legislators a few years ago. Now, let me just discuss what an Article 5, or you see a Roman numeral V when you see it in print many times. There are two ways to amend the U.S. Constitution. And the first way, under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, is where 2/3 of the U.S. House and Senate will agree to an amendment, and then it goes to the states for ratification. Sometimes there's a time frame on this ratification, sometimes not, like the 27th Amendment that was been floating around for years. And a lot of people don't understand, though, Congress can change the mode of ratification from the legislators to ratifying committees, and it was done when the 21st Amendment was repealed. The reason why they did that is because they thought certain dry states, like Utah, for example, would never go for it. There was probably a lot of dry states. So they had ratifying committees, which again is constitutional. The second way to amend the Constitution is something that's never been done under our current Constitution. And let's say that will stay our Constitution, we hope. That is where 2/3 of the legislators of the various houses around the country, state houses, propose an Article 5 convention. They call for one. And when these 2/3 of these calls are made, 34 states, Congress shall call for a constitutional convention. And whatever comes out of this convention, the amendments have to be ratified currently by 3/4 of the states. So that's the situation we have. Now, a little history. We've had calls from the beginning of our republic. Rhode Island was a 13th state, and they were kind of slow in accepting the Constitution, and they had a call immediately within a few months or a few years. So over the years, there have been a number of different calls, and by the way, there are a lot of old calls that we believe may still be valid. To give you an example, Vermont has a call from 1902 and 1903 calling for an amendment to outlaw polygamy and bigamy, which was being practiced in Utah. What they did was they just passed a law. They didn't need an amendment, and I think there were some states calling for the direct election of senators, and that eventually became an amendment without a con-con. In the late 70s to mid-80s, there was a real intense drive for a federal convention for a balanced budget amendment. New Hampshire actually passed it, as well as 32 states. So we were actually 2 states away. Now, most people who are what you would call fiscal conservatives have no trouble with a balanced budget, although I think we should have a constitutional budget. But it wasn't the purpose of the call, it was the call itself. And as I say, we've never had one under our current Constitution. And now there is a precedent. We had one under the Articles of Confederation, where they were supposed to amend the Constitution, at that time the Articles of Confederation, and they had to have all 13 states had to agree. Well, they decided to change the mode of ratification, and they decided to rewrite the Constitution. We're kind of glad that we did. They did what they did. But I'm afraid that the same caliber of people that were at that convention would not be at any future convention. There are no laws governing a convention as we speak. In 1979, the House, I think it was the Senate, the United States Senate, held hearings. I think Orrin Hatch was involved in that. And there's a big, thick book, of all the people that testified, but no law was passed. So the people who may be on the conservative side, they will get their they'll get their calls, and who's going to represent you at this convention? Well, most people don't even know. Before I would call for something, I should have some reasonable expectation. Who's going to represent me at this convention? You see. Now, New Hampshire, thanks to my cameraman here, Bill McNally, he played a large role in it. Every 2 years, from the early 90s, we tried to rescind all of New Hampshire's calls. And in 2010, it was finally done. we had mainly Republicans that supported the resolution, but you had a House majority where it was a Democrat majority, and Representative Timothy Cumberford. All of the calls were rescinded, so it was a clean slate. But within a short time, one of your state reps right from an ALEC meeting, American Legislative Exchange Council, he had a new one called, and again, we understand why there are a lot of people are upset at what's happening at the federal level, even at the state level. We can understand the motivation. Why? We have a freight train, a runaway freight train down in D.C. But what's on the calls is irrelevant, because I said it's a sovereign body. Hawaii has a call. The House of Representatives in Hawaii has a con call that passed the House. They want to have an amendment to make Obamacare constitutional. Well, if you need an amendment to make it constitutional, what's it tell you about it now, right? They want to be able to do away with the Electoral College. And there's many other things that we would say pretty unsound. So they're convinced that their people can get to this convention and then have their say. And it was interesting too, normally there's a lot of issues that are left-right. It's like there's people on the right like this and people on the left don't. This issue is very different though. You have people on both sides of the spectrum fighting tooth and nail. And people, the pro-Article 5 people, you get Mark Levin, the talk show host, Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity. These are what we refer to as neocon talk show hosts. You have Mike Ferris, who is the head of the Homeschool Legal Defense Fund, a group that I'm very in favor of. And on the left, you have people like Professor Lawrence Lessig. You have a group called Common Core, an advocacy group. You have a group called Wolfpack. If you go to Wolfpack's website, that looks like all they're advocating is a con, an Article 5 convention. And it's interesting too, because Glenn Beck supports an Article 5 convention, and if you ever listen to Glenn Beck, he speaks a lot about George Soros and how much he dislikes George Soros and how much he's trying to expose what George Soros is doing. Well, guess what George Soros is funding? Wolfpack, calling for a con. Then you have people on the left, you look at the Koch brothers, the embodiment of evil. Well, guess what they're funding? They're funding a group like ALEC, calling for a con. And so you have these people on both sides calling for it for different reasons. And it doesn't matter. Now here in New Hampshire, this is Tuesday, 2 days from now, there'll be hearings on two proposals, House Joint Resolution 10 and House Joint Resolution 11. One of them deals with an amendment to the Constitution to change the concept of personhood for corporations. And then I think number 10 is for a balanced budget. And by the way, you already passed a new call 2 years ago. You don't even need this. To me, this is a waste of time, because a live call is a live call. It's not like it sunsets after every session. I guess they want to cover the bases. So I recommend that people learn a little bit about this issue. And yes, maybe you admire that talk show host or that personality that you think is correct on this one. But give our position a look over too. We're concerned that these folks will have a whole brand new constitution. And sadly enough, we'll have a lot of constitutional illiteracy. I think most people agree to that. You ask your average state rep, have they read your Constitution? You ask your average state rep, have they read the state Constitution? And I bet you a lot of them haven't, you see. So with that, I want to thank you for coming. I want to, I'm sorry, yes, I got a few questions.
Yes, the New Hampshire currently has HJR 11 and HJR 10 on the bills for a new Article 5 convention. What's your opinion on that?
Well, they should stop them. They should not pass them. In fact, we should rescind the call that was passed 2 years ago. And again, I think these calls are unnecessary because you already have a live call. So I think the duty of the New Hampshire House and the Senate is to rescind the live call that was made about 2 years ago.
I don't mean to interrupt, but can you have the other speaker speak, and then maybe we will ask you both questions. Is that okay?
Sure, that's fine. So at this point, I'm going to bring up my good friend and colleague, Dan McGonigle, who has some comments on this subject. Dan?
Thank you, Hal. Hal Shurtleff. I've worked with Hal on various projects in the past. He's a great 21st century patriot that I know well. I've written a book titled Execute the Laws to Restore the Republic, and I'm here to voice my opinion to vote no against HJR 10 and HJR 11. And generally speaking, the amendment process is to restore proper governmental operations when necessary. That is, those operations being restricting government to enumerated powers and protecting natural rights. Now, the enforcement mechanisms of all that, restricting and protecting, are already enumerated in the Declaration, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and all 50 state constitutions. The enforcement mechanisms are already there. But we have a condition in this country where the Constitution and Bill of Rights are not being properly enforced. The preamble to the Constitution and Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution says to provide for the common defense. What is the common defense? Well, the Lockean principle, philosopher, 17th century English philosopher John Locke said that the end or purpose of civil government was the common defense of life, liberty, and property. Samuel Adams, the Boston Committee of Correspondence in 1772 wrote a report, The Rights of the Colonists. He stated the purpose of, or the end of government was the common defense of life, liberty, and property. Frederick Bastiat, a little pamphlet here called The Law, 1850, very famous French political economist, Frederick Bastiat, defined the law as the common defense of life, liberty, and property. So the purpose of government, the law is the purpose of government. The purpose of government is the law. Now the Constitution in Article 6 defines the laws, which is mentioned throughout the Constitution, the laws, and it defines the supreme law as being the Constitution. So the laws, the phrase "the laws," includes the Constitution. Now, throughout the Constitution, it talks about execution of the laws. The President is supposed to make sure that is done. And also in Article 1, Section 8, under legislative powers, there are state institutions composed of we the people that are enumerated to execute the laws when necessary. Now, the pamphlet that we distributed throughout the State House today, Levin's Risky Proposal, a Constitutional Convention. At the end of his pamphlet, the writer of this New American Magazine article, Larry Greenlee, states, the solution is to educate the electorate and enforce the Constitution, not to change or ignore it. So here we hear the word enforce again. Execute the laws, enforce. The purpose of government is the common defense of life, liberty, and property. This earlier article in the New American Magazine by Larry Greenlee, Dangers of a Constitutional Convention. He states at the end about how to safely restore good government and facilitate adherence to the Constitution, the existing Constitution. He's not talking about amending the Constitution. So go back to what I said earlier. The problem we have is lack of enforcement of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. These guys are talking about restoring and enforcing the Constitution. So the question remains, and it's very succinctly said by Dr. Edwin Vieira Jr., PhD, JD, top constitutional scholar, 21st century. In his article, Enforcement, Not Amendment, is the answer. He states, the all-important question is or remains to be. Exactly how are the new amendments to be enforced? When in fact, we're not enforcing the existing Constitution and Bill of Rights. So, I fail to see where where those new amendments would be enforced, how they would be enforced when they're not enforcing the existing documents, including the Bill of Rights and all the other amendments that were put in after the Bill of Rights. So what do we need to do? We need enforcement. So we need to restore the Constitution, like Mr. Greenlee says. We need to address the solution to educate the electorate and enforce the Constitution. So going back to what I said earlier, how do we enforce the Constitution? How do we implement the common defense of life, liberty, and property, the purpose of government? How do we do that? Well, that's a good question. How do we do it? When the federal government, when the legislative, executive, and the judicial branches aren't doing that, and the states are going along to get along, to get in on the federal dole, especially in the Department of Homeland Security. How do we do that? Well, we have to restore the explicit enforcement mechanisms that's already in all those documents I mentioned. We have to restore enforcement of the common defense of life, liberty, and property. People need to find out about it. They need to tell the state legislators to do it. The institution for doing that is a state institution, not a federal institution. Enforcement, domestic security, and enforcement, execution of the laws is a state institution, and we the people all belong to it. Any questions?
No, you go first, sorry.
So Dan, let me go to your premise for a second here. You're basically warning people if there's a constitutional convention and they implement, say, something to reverse Citizens United, there's no guarantee that even if that's done and everybody feels great, that anybody will actually enforce on some sort of police or lawsuit level the new rule that is passed, because they're essentially ignoring all of the other things that have already been done. Is that what you're saying?
See, the problem isn't the Constitution. It's the folks that are sent down to Washington, D.C. From all parts of the country that aren't getting the job done.
Okay.
And we have 4 delegates in New Hampshire, and depending on whom you may say, they're not getting the job done. So the notion that adding a few more amendments, or a whole bunch of them, will make any difference is sort of, I think, ridiculous. On the other hand, there's some folks, and we document these folks, so they're very outspoken, that we'll have this Article 5 because we wanted to change the basic structure of the Constitution. Back in the early 80s, there was a book called The Power to Lead by James McGonigle Burns, professor at Williams College. And he said, very boldly, that our founders were too smart for us, or too wise for us. We have to make right what they put asunder. And he's saying that the limited government, the various checks and balances were difficult to be able to do what his fellow, I guess, socialist or globalist or whatever they might be. Which is true, there's checks and balances. I mean, and states, something called the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment says that the Constitution gave specific powers to the federal government, and those that weren't specifically granted to them, or denied by the states, or retained by the states and to the people. But we forgot that. So a lot of these states who are advocating this, a lot of people in these states, well, folks, what are you going to do? You're going to cut yourself off from the federal government? Is that what you should do? That's what you're going to have to do if you really believe that. They're the same ones, by the way. And one of the premises, too, is that there's no way that 3/4 of the states would do anything ludicrous. There's no way any bad amendment will go through. Well, I'll tell you what, they're doing a lot of crazy things without a con, right? And they passed the 16th Amendment, didn't they, the states? Oh, yeah, income tax, but just the most wealthiest people, just 1% of the most wealthiest, right? The 17th Amendment, direct election of senators. The senators were actually ambassadors to the states. They weren't elected by the legislators. So the states gave up a lot of their power to that 17th Amendment. So states can do bad things all the time. I mean, they've embraced Common Core without even seeing it. And people on both left and right are opposing Common Core. They said, we'll take the money, you take Common Core. And they took the money, you see. So there are many things that are happening we have various people that have been writing about this. And just recently there was a forum on the Second Amendment at UConn, University of Connecticut. And there's a professor there, Meg Penrose, I think her name was, Penrose. And she got up there and she's very charming and very erudite, and she said she knows the Constitution inside and out, and she says we have to rewrite the Constitution. We have to do it through an Article 5 convention.
Let me follow up though. So I got the first concept, but let's take a step back. Supreme Court decides in the Citizens United case that any business, they didn't necessarily declare they were personhood, but they did declare that they could act in similar concepts of what we consider a person under the Constitution. So they determined that any of these corporations can do anything, mostly around political advertising and how they influence the races. Okay, so the next step, though, from that act, based on the separation of powers, is for either the executive or the legislative to act based on the ruling of the judiciary. So that would be either a bill or on the other side an executive order, which you wouldn't support. So follow me for a second. So if the judiciary decides something, the next step isn't the next step to have the legislative branch create a law to supersede the ruling of the judiciary, which is not necessarily so. Okay.
Article 2 of the Constitution says that Congress can limit the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. You don't even need the president to sign off on it. But you did that with the labor relations bills that were passed in the 30s.
But you're still going to need legislative action.
Yes.
To rescind, say, Citizens United.
That's correct.
Okay, so your point isn't necessarily that whether or not there should be action on that. Either way, leave it alone or do something. It's how you go about acting. Okay, gotcha. I'm completely following you.
I mean, like a balanced budget amendment. There are a lot of people who are conservative-minded people that want to see a balanced budget amendment. Well, if we had a constitutional budget, we wouldn't have to worry about being in trillions of dollars in debt. But we don't need a convention to get a balanced budget amendment. You get members of Congress that will simply not spend more than they take.
So your position isn't, though, your position isn't against state legislatures or passing changes through the process of rescinding a Citizens United ruling based on what the judiciary believes is the ruling. In other words, the process is set in place for legislatures and then the Congress to decide how to change those things. So it's your position is it's very dangerous to just open up the book completely and allow them to do anything because we can't trust them because they're not doing what they're supposed to do now.
That's correct.
Gotcha. Okay.
There's a group called Move to Amend, I think, that's pushing. And again, the amendment, that may be something we should do, but you don't need an amendment and you don't need a con to achieve it. And you may have a convention and your particular amendment may not even be addressed, you see. So all that work and effort for this, and you've got nothing accomplished.
Sorry, I got it.
Good question.
Yeah, maybe one more comment and we'll... Go ahead.
My question is, one of the New Hampshire representatives feels that he can introduce a House bill that will limit any delegate sent from New Hampshire down to Washington to strictly one amendment. Is that possible?
Okay. Yes, I had that in my mind as the last comment, and these 10 and 11, they're specific. They're calls for a constitutional convention to make very specific amendments, and that's what Bill's talking about, balanced budget amendment. Well, I have a textbook here it's a late 19th century law school textbook written by the top constitutional scholar of the late 19th century. It's Thomas Cooley, LLD, Doctor of Laws. And he speaks regarding the amendment process. He says, in this 1880 textbook, the only restriction imposed on the power to amend is this, that, and he quotes Article 5, that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. I'll read that again. The only restriction imposed on the power to amend, which would apply to a con, power to amend. The only restriction. Article 5, no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate, which means every state has to have an equal number of U.S. senators. That's the only thing that can be restricted to, not changing that. Everything else in the Constitution is open for change, according to Thomas Cooley, top scholar, late 19th century.
Let me interject. Two scholars, two constitutionalist scholars, one a Supreme Court Justice, Warren Burger, a man on the left side of the spectrum, wrote a letter to Phyllis Schlafly back in the late 80s and said there's no, in his opinion, you cannot limit a convention. Judge Robert Bork, who Mark Levin considers the greatest legal mind of his time, said something very similar. He said in his opinion, he said that you cannot limit a convention to one issue or to any issue. So here you have people on both sides of the spectrum, both people with all kinds of great academic legal background. And I would defer to these two gentlemen. They probably know a whole lot more than most of us. And so I would say we need to get people to understand this issue a little bit and communicate with elected officials and say we don't want an Article 5, period.
Are you? How long are you going to be up here working, speaking to legislators?
We'll be up here testifying on Thursday.
You're going to be
yeah, Thursday morning. So, okay, one more question.
Do you have any recommended videos on YouTube that would explain
Yes,
this Article
well,
5?
One hopefully we'll get up there, but also beware of Article 5, which we showed earlier. It's only 12 minutes long, right? Beware of con-cons. It's up on YouTube. You can go to a Facebook page called Choose Freedom, Stop the Constitutional Convention, to get all kinds of references too. And if you go to jbs.org, you can see the drop-down issues, Article 5, Convention, and you can actually get something called a no-con kit with all kinds of documents. Some of the letters I mentioned from Warren Burger, you can get model resolutions that you can get introduced to your states. So I think we can win this issue, folks. We just have to get more people in. Sit down and get them to understand it. Turn off the radio for a few minutes and get a chance to look at some of our material and look at the other side. So thank you very much.